Hi, founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Phillis Wheatley, a slave who became a master poet. And to talk about Phillis Wheatley, we are joined by one of our favorite guests, Jane Hampton Cook. Jane, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah, now, as always, I said, hey, you want to talk about the American Revolution? You said yes. And I said, who do you want to talk about? And you brought up Phillis Wheatley, who's an amazing person. Can you give us a little background on Phillis, where she was from? And, well, as I said, she was a slave, so if you can comment on that.
That's right. So she came over from Africa. She left in 1760, the same year that King George III took the throne. And she came to Boston in 1761. And a family, it was what was unusual is that there weren't many girls on ships like this. There were, it was mostly boys and men. And so the family that took her named her after the ship that she arrived on. The ship was called the Phillis. And when it was John and Susanna Wheatley, and they were looking to hire, train a slave as a domestic servant. And when they got her into their home, she was the same age as a daughter that they had had who died at age 8. And so she really seized their hearts because they realized, oh, this is the same age, as of the daughter that we lost. And then Phyllis began to show an interest in writing letters, and she would mark on the wall and was learning English. And they soon realized she just was gifted with language. And they made this is what I love about the Wheatleys. They made this countercultural decision to educate Phyllis instead of training her as a domestic servant. And they gave her all sorts of books. She knew Homer, she knew the Iliad, the Odyssey. She had read the same books, that John Hancock read at Harvard. You can tell by her poetry that she was very well versed in literature and in the Bible. And so that's what I think is remarkable, is that her story first starts with that family making this countercultural decision.
Yeah.
And I discovered that the church that they went to in Boston was, the minister was the grandson of the first abolitionist in America, the first person who wrote the first tract in 1700 saying that slavery was wrong. And I think that's an interesting, connection.
Yeah.
Um, and so she just was gifted and began writing poems. And her Mr. Wheatley ran a tailor shop, and John Hancock would come into his tailor shop, and Phyllis would read her poems. And when she got to a point where she was publishing or wanting to publish, Hancock was one of the ones who signed off on recommending her to a patron in England to publish her poetry. And so that's kind of the first half of her story,
Right. And
is that
she gets
was gifted.
published. Her first publication is actually in England.
It's in England, and she went over to England in 1773. Um, Talked to the patron, her work was published. And what I also love about Phyllis, not only was she countercultural, and her story was later used to call for the abolition of slavery in newspapers in the 1790s, but also she was a great example of what everybody was going through. Should we be a loyalist or a patriot? And she wrote a poem to King George III, 1768, praising him and his lauding him. And then 2 years later, the Boston Massacre happened down the street from where she lived. And that seems to really have changed her. She wrote a poem about the massacre. It was published in the newspaper on the day of the funeral, um, for those who died. And then within a few years, she's writing this poem about George Washington and mailing it to him. And so you can see that transformation from being loyal to the king to choosing, um, you know, want to have freedom and a representative government through these patriots in the Continental Army.
Right.
And that was just something that really struck me about her, as you can
Yeah.
see that transformation in her poetry.
Well, it's really interesting because, as you said, she was educated, uh, given a vastly superior education than most slaves were given. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I wonder if, again, and we're heading into the peak of the Enlightenment, as I like to say, when the American Revolution occurred. So, I wonder how much, that she actually learned about politics itself as opposed to what she assumed, not assumed, but consumed just living in
Right.
Massachusetts at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So with be living in a tailor shop, she was the men of the day, the John Hancocks and the Samuel Adams were coming in and out of that tailor store. And
Right.
so you have to think that she picked up on a lot of what was going on that way. And
Right.
whatever, of course, politics were of the Wheatley family, that they picked up, she picked up soon, consumed all of that. And she wrote about what I included her in my book, the white one here,
Yeah. Link in the
Resilience on
link in the
Parade. I
description below.
included her poem about, that's right. And but it's about suffrage and women calling for the right to vote. But I included her poem that she wrote to George Washington because it's about Columbia, which was the female personification of America. And she talked about, you know, Columbia's anxious breast, calling for freedom, and she tied that to George Washington because she wanted Columbia to lead George Washington in virtue. So Columbia was like a goddess. And you would see Columbia or America depicted as a woman, a female goddess in newspaper or prints. I guess probably not newspapers, but in prints that they would make.
Right,
Um,
engravings.
in engravings, exactly. And so America, was referred to as a she for a really long time and was personified this way. So she wrote this poem, and I thought that was just a great poem. But she also sent it. She had the courage to send it to George Washington when he's at camp in Cambridge in 1776, because Boston's under lockdown and by the British, and he's got all the Continental Militia Army out in the countryside. She sends him this letter, and he writes her back in early 1777. And he thanks her, he compliments her talent, that she's gifted by the muses, and he offers to meet with her if she's ever in Cambridge. And we don't have any documented evidence that they actually physically met because it wasn't that long that he pushed the British out of Boston. So it's
Right.
kind of unlikely that they met. But he wrote her back. And what's really fascinating to me, this was probably George Washington's first exposure to a Black person who had this level of education.
Right.
And he asked one of his secretaries to get her letter published in the newspaper. And so her letter was published as given to George Washington at Cambridge in several newspapers around the states. And that he also closed his letter to her, "Your most humble and obedient servant."
Right.
And that was a very common way that he would close his letters. It was a common, ending to letters back then. And so I thought that was interesting that he treated her with the same respect
Right.
as he did other people. And we know, that at the end of his life, George Washington freed his slaves in his will. And that was a countercultural decision because that wasn't common at that point. And I like to think that Phillis and others like Peter Salem in the Continental Army and others just planted the seeds,
Right.
that grew over time to see things differently, because she certainly challenged your people's preconceptions
Right.
of
She paved
of,
the way
of
even for someone like Benjamin Banneker, who would argue the same things with Thomas Jefferson 20 years later. She helped
stereotypes.
open those doors. It's really interesting to me that you keep using the word countercultural, the term countercultural. It makes it makes perfect sense because it was obviously not what the culture was doing at the time. But yeah,
No,
it's
and you do see this slow people. I think as the ideas of the revolution take hold, you do see people on a more individual level realizing slavery is just incongruent with these founding principles. And you see, like I was Benjamin Franklin in 1790, his last letter to Congress was about abolishing slavery
right.
right before he died. So you do see that people realizing the incongruence, and it was like almost like an individual conversion um, I, of that thought, because more and more of those northern states
Yeah.
began to outlaw or restrict slavery.
Right.
Vermont was the 14th state, and it was the only one that came into the Union slave free from the beginning. It was
Right.
the
Well,
first one, I should
one of the
say.
funny things I like about Massachusetts, just a few years after uh, uh, um, lost it for a second. Phillis Wheatley is writing these poems. I mean, they
Yep.
passed their constitution in 1780, and then Elizabeth Freeman and Sedgwick, his first name escapes me, they sue for her freedom, and they say, no, 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 you've already eliminated slavery in the Constitution a few years ago. So, like,
Yes. Yeah.
Massachusetts was kind of like, whoops, but at the same time, obviously, slavery in New England was a lot different than it was in certain
It
southern
was.
states.
It was.
Uh,
It was. It was smaller.
right,
There
it
was
wasn't the gigantic plantation. It was
scale that in some of the
actually
states. Yeah.
one of the ways I've heard it described, and maybe you comment on this, is that generally slaves were considered, unfortunately, much the same way women were, as children who were part of the family but needed to
Hmm.
be taken care of. But Phillis Wheatley
Right. As the
actually became adopted into the family.
Yeah, she did, exactly. And I think they really treated her as a daughter in many ways. And, they were out, her family was out pushing her poetry to newspaper editors and,
Right.
and they really rallied to get her work published. And she is the first African American to have to be a published author.
Yeah, and she was pretty
She
widely read. I mean, you said George Washington, but I understand uh, there was a little bit of argument to it. Like, I know Thomas Jefferson read her work. He may not have thought she was quite as good a poet as certain other people did. Um, but there was
Right.
a debate at the time about whether or not she was actually talented.
Right, right. And she had this introspection to her. She wrote a poem, I may not get the Greek name right, to Maecenas, who was a patron of Homer. And she talks about Terence, who would in ancient history had been a slave and was had a patron and was freed, very much like her. This is in ancient history over in Greece. And and John Hancock read Terence's works because he donated it to Harvard's library. And so she talks, she taps into things where she sees a common thread. She related to Terence's story. They had a similar story, hundreds of years later. And so I think people liked her poetry because they recognized things in it. They recognized references to Homer and the Bible. And a lot of her early poems were obituaries for people who died in Boston. And that's kind of how she got started, was that when someone would die, she would write their obit, but in poetry form.
That's amazing, and it's also interesting because she's probably over the heads of most of us today in a lot of the poetry she's writing. So,
Absolutely.
why don't we go and look at her later life? Because her later life is fairly interesting as well, if I'm not mistaken. She goes on to get married.
She does. She gets married, and this is where you see the struggle part of her story. They financially struggle as a couple. She's a really talented woman, but she's married to someone who's, I'm not saying not as talented, but not probably not as well educated, frankly, as she was.
You
And
were.
there's struggle, and she died young. Um, and she lost children, and so the end of her life is certainly a sad one in that respect.
Well, is
But
she? The Wheatley family liberates her. If I'm
they do,
right,
yes, so they do free her,
but then
yes.
she's kind of on her own, and no matter how
Right.
educated you are as
After
a
they pass
right,
away. So the financial backing, she lost that. Even though she was a free person, it was hard in that culture to thrive financially. um Even though she was a free person, but her husband just couldn't make a lot of money. um
where does she spend her life? Does she return to England?
no, she spends it in
In
Boston.
Boston? Okay.
Yeah, in Boston. So she's in Boston. And I was looking I do a lot of research on genealogybank.com, which is a historical newspaper database that I pay for because I use it a lot. And it was really fascinating just to see an ad. They republished her volumes of poetry after her death, and they were using the proceeds to raise money for an abolition society. And this is probably 1790, 1791, somewhere in there during George Washington's presidency. So early on, the abolitionist movement seized on her as an example of here, of her story from slave to free. Look at her talent
Right.
and
Look at what can be done.
look at what can be done.
Again,
Yeah.
peak of the Enlightenment. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
Jane, thank you so much for coming back and joining us. We hope to hear from you again soon.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Jason.
Absolutely. Founder fans, of course, thanks again to Jane Hampton Cook. She is amazing. As always, she'll be back soon, I assure you. Make sure you hit like and subscribe for videos 5 days a week. And on Fridays, we play trivia. Make sure you're here on Friday for a little bit of fun. And we'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.